Thank you for the opportunity to present today. This is a little bit of a change of pace. I think Michael began with, as part of his acknowledgement of country, the recognition of the importance of place to everything we do. And so what I propose to do for the next 15 minutes or so is to look at the role of context with research and look at the ways in which conducting research within Sydney Local Health District has benefits not only for people working here and living here, but also internationally, and also bring to you some experience from clinical trials that we've conducted in other contexts, particularly Vietnam, and look at how research which is conducted in collaboration with international partners can have quite significant impacts globally and including in Australia. So as Warwick mentioned, tuberculosis is a really major global cause of morbidity and mortality. It's the commonest cause of infectious death worldwide. And the reason for talking about it today in the context of clinical trials is I think it's a disease which challenges us as to how we can respond to this and shows us that in order to deal with the problem in one context, we need to deal with the problem globally. And just by way of background, before I begin talking about the research, this is a little bit of a primer on what tuberculosis is. You'll see here on the left-hand side of the screen a picture of the bacteria which causes tuberculosis. And the bacteria is spread through sputum, which is coughed and produces droplets and can spread to people who are nearby. And the reason why that is important is that tuberculosis is not only an issue for the patient themselves, but also an issue for people who are around them. And as you can see on the right-hand image there, if people have severe disease, they can be very infectious. And so it's important to be able to diagnose people with tuberculosis and treat them before they can spread disease to other people. Now, tuberculosis is a disease where we've had very effective therapies for about 50 years. And in Australia, more than 97% of people who have tuberculosis are cured of tuberculosis. So then the question becomes, why are there still as many cases of TB today as there have been in human history? And you can see why Australia perhaps may have forgotten about tuberculosis. Sometimes when I speak to patients in clinic, they say to me, "Doctor, hasn't tuberculosis been cured? Don't we have a vaccine for that? Is it still a problem today?" And so the reason that we have that perception here in Australia is that we have a much lower incidence of tuberculosis than globally. Most TB occurs in resource-limited settings, and you can see that about 2/3 of tuberculosis occurs in our region. Now, this is what happened in Australia. From about the 1960s, we had a really effective program for controlling tuberculosis. A combination of effective treatment as well as screening saw the prevalence of tuberculosis drop dramatically. And so over the last 20 years or so, we've had a pretty constant low-level rate of tuberculosis. Now, I just put in here as a dotted line the current incidence of tuberculosis in Sydney Local Health District to make the point that in Sydney we actually have amongst one of the highest incidence of tuberculosis in Australia. So you might say, well, why is this? What's going on here? And the answer is from these data from our program in Australia that show you that most tuberculosis in Australia comes from people who've come from these high burden settings. And you can see some countries there which are the commonest sources of TB in Australia, including many countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And so, therefore, if we're going to be able to address the problem of tuberculosis in Sydney Local Health District, we're going to have to address the problem of tuberculosis globally, because this infectious disease does not stop at the border. About 90% of TB in Australia comes from people who are born overseas and come into Australia. And as I've mentioned, it's a curable disease, and we have very effective treatments and very effective methods of prevention. Now, what I'm going to talk about is a way in which globally research is important for the perspective of those high-burden countries, but also important for Australia as well. And the Ntb Strategy is a global ambition to reduce the incidence of tuberculosis and by 2050 to eliminate the disease globally. Our Federal Minister of Health, Greg Hunt, has recently recommitted Australia to this objective. And so then the question for us as researchers is how can we develop the tools that are required to go and achieve this ambitious objective? And so the broad question for the remainder of my talk then is, how can international clinical trials improve the care of patients with tuberculosis? How are clinical trials relevant to this problem? And I'm going to talk about 3 different trials which have been conducted here in Sydney and also internationally. On the left-hand side, talking about detecting tuberculosis, how do we find more cases of tuberculosis? And then secondly, I'll talk about 2 trials where we're looking at how we can prevent tuberculosis and how we can use the evidence from those clinical trials to improve practice in Australia. So first of all, this is a study which was conducted by researchers from Australia in partnership with the Vietnam National Tuberculosis Program. And you see here a skyscape of Hanoi, which is the capital of Vietnam, which is one of the 8 provinces in which this research occurred. And the question that we undertook to answer was, can we determine what is the case detection rate of tuberculosis using active case finding compared to usual care amongst the contacts of patients with smear-positive tuberculosis? And secondarily, we wanted to look at whether these strategies were going to be feasible and were going to be cost-effective. Now, if any of you have ever worked with tuberculosis in Australia, you'll know that we screen contacts of tuberculosis routinely as a part of standard care in Australia. But you may be interested to know that there's been no randomised controlled trial that previously had been performed to evaluate whether this is effective. And so for that reason, in most of the world, in countries including Vietnam, it was not practiced. And there was no systematic approach for screening people for tuberculosis if they had been in contact with patients with active TB. And this is an example of where a gap in the evidence prevents programs from committing resources. And so therefore this was an important trial to do for the benefit of people in high burden settings. Now, Vietnam is a country of almost 100 million people. It has about the 13th highest number of TB cases in the world. It has a high prevalence of drug-resistant tuberculosis. And it also has around 130,000 people who are diagnosed with TB each year. You contrast that to Australia, where we have about 1,400 new cases of TB each year. So one clear reason to do clinical trials in a setting like Vietnam is because it's much easier to recruit patients to large-scale studies. We'd have to wait years to recruit enough patients with tuberculosis in Australia to be able to answer the same questions that we can answer in a matter of a few years in Vietnam. The design of our study was a cluster randomised controlled trial. And in this study, people were in either the intervention arm, which was randomised to systematic screening using chest x-rays and a combination of sputum tests 4 times over 2 years, or in the standard of care arm on the other side of the screen, they received the usual passive case finding, where people waited till they came in to be screened for tuberculosis. And this is a schema. 4 times over the 2 years, they were screened with a chest x-ray and symptom screening. And this is what we do here in Sydney today. That is, we screen people who have been in close contact to find out whether they have tuberculosis. Now, we conducted the study across 8 different provinces of Vietnam. One of the reasons for doing multi-centre studies, multi-centre clinical trials, is because you can learn a lot about how the trial works in different contexts. And so we did the research both in urban and rural settings, in the north and the centre and the south of the country, which represented a wide range of different epidemiological contexts. The findings of the study, which were published last year, are shown here. And we found that by screening people who are contacts of patients with tuberculosis, in the intervention arm there was 2.5 times higher rate of tuberculosis notified compared to the control arm. This is amongst about 25,000 household contacts who were screened. And when we looked at the number of people who had confirmed tuberculosis based upon sputum testing, we found that there was a 6.5 times greater case notification rate in the intervention group compared to the control group. And we found that you needed to screen about 75 people in order to detect and notify an additional case of TB. And we also showed that it is highly cost-effective, of about $500 per disability-adjusted life year that's prevented. So in other words, we have evidence now that shows that in Vietnam, this intervention, which is relatively simple using existing tools, can have a significant increase in case detection at an affordable cost. And as a post hoc analysis, we also showed that it reduced mortality by 40% amongst the intervention arm compared to the control arm. So this research therefore has implications quite broadly. For Vietnam and for many other countries like Vietnam, this provides the impetus required for governments to go and fund active case finding. For Australia, it provides us with the evidence that what we're doing is effective and allows us to go and demonstrate that we should be still investing in TB prevention, even though we have a low burden of disease, because it's so important to prevent TB from spreading again in our community. And it also demonstrates how collaborative research between researchers in Australia and internationally can conduct these large-scale studies and bring the skills of both people from high-burden settings and from Australia to address these problems. So having talked about case finding, which is an important global priority for TB, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about prevention. And this is much more aligned to what we do in Australia, where a lot of the work we do in the TB clinic is screening people who've been infected but haven't yet developed the disease. And so I'm going to talk about these two trials, the first of which was conducted in Sydney Local Health District, and the second of which is ongoing in Vietnam. Again, a little bit of a primer about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is actually a disease which affects the lungs, but in about 9 out of 10 people, their immune system is able to control the bacteria so they never develop disease. And so people who've been infected can, at a later stage, go on to develop active tuberculosis. And they may develop it immediately, but they also may develop it many years down the track. And so the challenge that we have is how do we identify interventions that can prevent people from going on to develop active disease. And this is quite important in Australia. A lot of the patients who we give very strong immunosuppressive medications to or who have transplants may have come from countries where they've been infected with TB, and if we don't screen and treat them, then they may go on to develop tuberculosis, which can be very severe if they've got those immunological impairments at the time. And so this is an example from Vietnam of how we screen people for infection. So this is a girl who's a part of one of our studies having a skin test which identifies her reactivity to the antigen present on Mycobacterium tuberculosis. To give you some perspective, around 25% of the world's population have been infected with this bacteria. And so it's an extremely common problem for many countries. And it's the main reason why Australia still has ongoing TB, because most of our cases come amongst people who reactivate after infection. So one of the problems with latent tuberculosis infection has been the length of treatment. So until recently, the standard of care in Australia has been 9 months of therapy with a drug called isoniazid. And that reduces the incidence of tuberculosis by about 80%. The problem is that for people who have treatment with isoniazid, around 2 to 3% will have significant liver complications, which may require them to stop treatment. And a proportion of people will die as a result of the severe hepatotoxicity. And so then the question was, how could we develop an intervention that could have an effective treatment but could be less toxic than the treatments which we currently have available? And so the 4RIF trial involved randomising people to either the standard of care or a 4-month treatment with daily rifampicin, with follow-up to monitor for incident disease. Now, Australia was a part of a 10-country study, which was led by McGill University, and Sydney Local Health District and also Southwestern Sydney Local Health District were involved. The results of the study, which came out last year, showed that, in fact, the two treatments, the 9-month treatment, which was more toxic, had equal effectiveness compared to the short 4-month therapy. And also it showed that there was a 1.5% reduction in severe liver toxicity, which is an 80% reduction in liver toxicity. So this study demonstrated that by reducing the incidence of tuberculosis in a non-toxic way, we could then offer people treatment which could then be applicable not just in all of the countries here, but in fact globally. And so this policy is now changing policy and practice. This evidence rather is changing policy and practice around the world. And just to conclude then with a study which is still ongoing in Vietnam, that again illustrates the way that international trials can change practice. The VQuin trial is looking at a particular group of people who have been infected with tuberculosis. That is, people who are infected with drug-resistant TB. So those bacteria are not responsive to either isoniazid or rifampicin. And so in order to evaluate what we need to treat people with, we need to find people who've been exposed to people who have drug-resistant TB. The problem is in Australia, we only have about 30 people a year in this category, so it's impossible to do that study here. And so for that reason, Vietnam was an ideal place to do the study. It's a place where there's about 5,000 people with drug-resistant TB each year, and it was a place where we have had success in setting up a clinical trials infrastructure. And so we've addressed this question by conducting a placebo-controlled randomised trial looking at the effectiveness of a 6-month course of oral levofloxacin, which is a very well-tolerated drug, against a placebo. And it's been conducted in 10 provinces in Vietnam. And the evidence from this study, as well as 2 other studies which are yet to commence, will provide the first randomised controlled data about how to treat these contacts. And so just again, in conclusion, tuberculosis, I think, is a disease which shows you that an international approach is required to develop evidence. Doing studies only in Australia or only internationally is not sufficient to get the evidence we need, but by bringing together an international perspective, both in multi-centre studies and also studies in high-burden countries, we can develop evidence that will improve patient care globally, in Australia, and also change policy and practice. And I'd just finally like to acknowledge the Ntb CRE, which is an NHMRC-funded group to support research both in Australia and internationally, and also ACTNet, which is an Australasian research group, again focusing on clinical trials and other research in Australia to develop evidence to control tuberculosis. So thank you for your attention, and I acknowledge all of the people involved in this research.